For 27 years, the world thought they knew the story. Princess Diana, the people's princess, died in a tragic car accident in Paris, leaving behind 2 young sons and a legacy of compassion that touched millions. The narrative was sealed, the case closed, the grief processed. But what happens when the one person who stayed silent for nearly 3 decades finally decides to speak? Earl Charles Spencer, Diana's younger brother, has carried secrets that could reshape everything the public believes about his sister's final years. These aren't the whispered rumors of tabloids or the speculation of conspiracy theorists. These are the words of the man who knew Diana before she became a princess, who watched her transform under the weight of royal expectations, and who made a promise at her funeral that he's never fully kept, until now. In a world where royal secrets are currency and truth is often buried beneath protocol, one man's decision to break his silence threatens to unravel carefully constructed narratives. The question isn't just what Charles Spencer knows about his sister's life and death. It's why he's choosing to speak now and what price he's willing to pay for the truth. Some stones are better left unturned. Some secrets are meant to stay buried. But sometimes the weight of silence becomes heavier than the consequences of speaking. This is the story of a brother's burden, a family's hidden pain, and revelations that could change how the world remembers the woman who captured hearts across the globe. The truth, as they say, will set you free. But first, it might destroy everything you thought you knew. The morning mist clung to the grounds of Althorpe House like a shroud, obscuring the ancient oak trees that had witnessed centuries of Spencer family secrets. Charles Spencer stood at the window of his study, the same room where he had once practiced speeches as a nervous young earl, now weathered by decades of carrying truths too heavy for one man's shoulders. The letter in his hand trembled slightly, not from the October cold seeping through the old windows, but from the weight of the decision he was about to make. It had arrived 3 days earlier, unremarkable among the Morning Post except for the familiar handwriting on the envelope. Sarah Ferguson, Duchess of York, had written to him before, but never like this. Her words were careful, measured, yet beneath the formality lay an urgency that Charles recognized all too well. She had been contacted by a journalist, she explained, someone digging into Diana's final years with unprecedented access to previously sealed documents. The investigation was moving forward with or without their cooperation, she warned. The choice was whether the truth would be told by those who loved Diana, or by those who simply saw her as a story to sell. Charles set the letter down on his mahogany desk, the same desk where his father had once planned Diana's introduction to society, where he himself had written the eulogy that had moved the world to tears. The irony wasn't lost on him. 27 years ago, he had stood before Westminster Abbey and promised to protect his sister's memory, to ensure her sons knew the truth about their mother. He had kept half that promise, perhaps the easier half. The house around him held memories in every corner. Down the hall, Diana's childhood bedroom remained largely unchanged, a shrine to the girl she had been before the world claimed her. The pink wallpaper, though faded, still bore the marks of her teenage dreams. Small holes where she had pinned photos of her favorite pop stars, gentle indentations where she had pressed too hard with her pen while writing in her diary. Charles often wondered what she had written in those pages, what secrets a 17-year-old girl could have harbored that would seem insignificant compared to the weight she would later carry. The decision to speak hadn't come suddenly. It had been building for months, perhaps years, like pressure in a fault line waiting for the right tremor to cause an earthquake. The catalyst had been an unexpected phone call from his nephew, Prince William, 3 weeks earlier. The future king had called not about royal duties or family obligations, but about something far more personal and painful. William had been going through some of his mother's personal effects, items that had been stored away after her death, deemed too private for public consumption. Among them, he had found letters, diaries, and photographs that painted a picture of Diana's final months that was starkly different from the public narrative. The discoveries had shaken him. William confided to his uncle, not because they revealed anything scandalous or shameful, but because they showed the depth of his mother's pain and isolation in ways he had never understood as a 15-year-old boy grieving her loss. Charles remembered the weight in William's voice as he spoke about finding a particular entry in Diana's diary, dated just weeks before her death. In it, she had written about feeling trapped, not just by the paparazzi or the pressures of public life, but by secrets she felt she could never share. She wrote about phone calls in the middle of the night, about feeling followed even when she was supposedly safe, about conversations with people who claimed to have her best interests at heart, but whose motives she had begun to question. The entry that had affected William most, however, was simpler and somehow more devastating. Diana had written about calling Charles one evening, desperate to talk to someone who had known her before she became a princess. But Charles had been traveling, and she had hung up without leaving a message. She wrote about how alone she felt in that moment, how even her own family seemed unreachable when she needed them most. William's voice had broken slightly as he recounted reading those words, and Charles had felt the familiar stab of guilt that had haunted him for decades. That conversation with William had reopened wounds that Charles thought he had learned to live with. He began to remember things he had pushed aside, details that had seemed unimportant at the time, but now took on new significance. He recalled Diana's behavior in the months before her death, how she had seemed simultaneously more confident and more fragile than he had ever seen her. She had been making plans, talking about the future with an enthusiasm that had surprised everyone who knew her, yet there had been moments of darkness that she couldn't quite hide. Charles walked to the safe hidden behind a portrait of his ancestor, the first Earl Spencer. Inside, alongside important documents and family heirlooms, lay a collection of items he had never shown anyone. There were letters Diana had written to him over the years, starting from when she was just a child and continuing until a few weeks before her death. There were photographs she had sent him, candid shots that showed glimpses of her private life away from the cameras. And there was something else, something that had arrived at Althorpe House 2 days after Diana's funeral, a package with no return address, but unmistakably in her handwriting. He had never opened it. For 27 years, the package had remained sealed, like Pandora's box sitting in a safe. Diana had written his name on it in her careful script, along with a single word: truth. Nothing more, no instructions about when to open it or what to do with its contents. Just his name and that one word that had haunted him ever since. The package wasn't large, perhaps the size of a notebook, but it had weight beyond its physical dimensions. Charles had lifted it countless times over the years, held it in his hands while wrestling with whether Diana had intended for him to open it immediately or to wait. The lack of specific instructions had paralyzed him, and as months became years, the decision to leave it unopened had become a choice in itself. Now, with Sarah's letter fresh in his mind, and William's pain still echoing in his ears, Charles found himself questioning every decision he had made since Diana's death. Had his silence protected her memory, or had it simply protected the comfortable lies that allowed everyone else to move on? The journalist Sarah had mentioned wasn't going away, and other members of Diana's inner circle were beginning to speak. If the story was going to be told, Charles realized perhaps it was time for him to tell his part of it. He thought about Diana's sons, now men with families of their own, and wondered what they deserved to know about their mother. William had already glimpsed some of the truth in those personal effects, but Charles suspected there was more, much more, that remained hidden. Harry, always more like Diana in temperament and vulnerability, had spent years struggling with his mother's legacy and his own place in the world. Did they have a right to know everything, even if it might change how they remembered her? The weight of responsibility felt crushing. Charles had spent his adult life as a guardian of family secrets, a keeper of aristocratic discretion. The Spencer family had always understood that privacy was not just a luxury, but a necessity, that some truths were too dangerous or too painful to share with the world. But Diana had never been entirely part of that world, had she? Even as a child, she had possessed an openness, a desire for authentic connection that had set her apart from their family's traditional reserve. Charles returned to his desk and pulled out a leather-bound journal, the same type he had used since university. He opened it to a blank page and began to write, not the carefully constructed prose of a public statement, but the raw, unfiltered thoughts of a man who had kept silent too long. The words came slowly at first, then faster as decades of suppressed emotions found their voice. He wrote about the Diana the world had never seen, the sister who had called him in tears after particularly brutal attacks in the press, who had confided her fears about her son's safety, who had shared her dreams of a different kind of life. He wrote about the conversations they had shared in the months before her death, conversations that had taken on new meaning in light of what happened. He wrote about the questions he should have asked, the warnings he should have heeded, the protection he should have offered. As the afternoon light faded, Charles found himself writing about guilt, the kind that burrows deep into your bones and becomes part of your very structure. Survivor's guilt, yes, but something more complex than that. The guilt of the living who must decide how to honor the dead, who must choose between comfortable lies and difficult truths. The guilt of a brother who had loved his sister, but had failed to save her from a world that had consumed her piece by piece. The phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was his assistant, reminding him about an evening appointment he had forgotten. Charles looked at the pages he had filled, surprised by how much had poured out of him. The words stared back at him, raw and honest in ways that his public statements had never been. For the first time in years, he felt something approaching clarity. He walked back to the safe and removed Diana's unopened package, holding it against the light as if he could divine its contents without breaking the seal. Whatever was inside, he realized was meant for him. Diana had trusted him with it, had believed that someday he would know what to do with whatever truth it contained. Perhaps that day had finally come. The decision crystallized in that moment. Charles would speak not just about Diana's life, but about her death, about the questions that had never been properly answered, and the fear she had shared with him in those final months. He would open the package she had left for him and face whatever consequences that brought. He would honor his promise to protect her memory not by hiding the truth, but by ensuring it was told with love and respect rather than sensationalism and speculation. But first he would need allies. The royal establishment would not welcome his decision, and there would be attempts to discredit or silence him. He would need people who had also loved Diana, who understood the difference between protecting her and protecting the institutions that had failed her. Sarah Ferguson would be crucial, as would Diana's former staff members who had remained loyal to her memory. And, most importantly, he would need the support of William and Harry, even if what he revealed might be painful for them to hear. Charles picked up his phone and dialed Sarah's number. When she answered, he could hear the hope and fear in her voice. She had been waiting for this call, perhaps for years. "Sarah," he said quietly, "it's time. I'm ready to tell Diana's story, all of it. But I'm going to need your help." The silence on the other end stretched for a long moment before Sarah's voice came back, stronger and more determined than before. "Charles, I've been ready for 27 years. What do you need me to do?" As they began to plan, Charles felt something he hadn't experienced since Diana's death, a sense of purpose that felt aligned with love rather than duty. The truth would be painful for all of them, but silence had proven to be even more destructive. Diana deserved to have her real story told, not the sanitized version that had become official history, but the complex, human tale of a woman who had tried to live authentically in a world that demanded performance. The sun had fully set by the time Charles finished his conversation with Sarah. Tomorrow, he would begin the process of breaking his decades-long silence. Tomorrow, the world would begin to learn what really happened to Diana, Princess of Wales. But tonight, he sat alone in his study, surrounded by the ghosts of family history, and finally felt at peace with his decision to honor the truth over comfort, love over protocol, and his sister's memory over the institution that had never truly understood her. The sealed package sat on Charles Spencer's desk like an accusation, its edges worn from years of handling, but the tape still intact across the seam. 3 days had passed since his conversation with Sarah Ferguson. 3 days of sleepless nights and careful planning. The journalist Sarah had mentioned, Rebecca Morrison from The Guardian, had agreed to meet with them, but only after Charles had made one condition clear. He would control the narrative, not be led by it. Charles had spent those 3 days reaching out to others who had been close to Diana in her final years. The responses had been mixed, revealing the complex web of loyalties and fears that had surrounded the princess even in death. Some, like her former private secretary Patrick Jeffson, had welcomed the opportunity to finally speak openly about the concerns they had harbored for years. Others, particularly those still connected to the royal household, had reacted with barely concealed panic. The most difficult conversation had been with Diana's sons. Charles had driven to Kensington Palace on a gray Tuesday morning, his heart heavy with the knowledge that what he was about to share would likely change how William and Harry understood their mother's final months. The meeting had been arranged quietly, away from the usual protocols and official channels. Just an uncle visiting his nephews, though all three men knew it was much more than that. William had aged noticeably since their last meeting, the weight of future kingship etched in lines around his eyes that seemed too deep for a man in his early 40s. Harry, still carrying the restless energy that had always reminded Charles so much of Diana, had flown in from California specifically for this conversation. The brothers sat side by side on the sofa in William's private sitting room, and Charles was struck by how much they looked like their mother when they were worried. "Before I tell you what I know," Charles had begun carefully, "I need you both to understand that your mother loved you more than her own life. Nothing I'm going to share changes that. If anything, it shows the lengths she was willing to go to protect you, even when she felt she couldn't protect herself." The revelation had started simply enough. Charles explained about the package Diana had sent to Althorpe, about the letter she had written in her final weeks, about conversations they had shared that he had never repeated to anyone. But, as he continued, the picture that emerged was of a woman who had been living in increasing fear, not just of the paparazzi, but of something more specific and more dangerous. Diana had confided to Charles that she believed her phones were being monitored, not by the press, but by people with official authority. She had mentioned strange incidents, cars that followed her when she was supposed to be traveling privately, hotel rooms that felt as though they had been searched while she was out, conversations that somehow became public knowledge despite being held in supposedly secure locations. At first, Charles had dismissed these concerns as paranoia, a natural result of years of intense media scrutiny and the psychological pressure of her failing marriage. But Diana had been specific, detailed in ways that suggested she wasn't imagining threats, but documenting them. She had started keeping records. She told him evidence of what she believed was systematic surveillance and intimidation. William's face had grown increasingly pale as Charles spoke, while Harry's expression had hardened into something Charles recognized from Diana, a determination to fight back against forces that sought to control her. When Charles mentioned the unopened package, Harry had immediately demanded to know why he had never opened it. Because, Charles had replied honestly, "I was afraid of what I might find, and I was afraid of what I might be obligated to do with that information." The conversation had continued for hours, with Charles sharing memories and observations that painted a picture of Diana's final year as something far more complex than the public had ever known. He spoke about her growing sense of isolation from the royal family, but also about her increasing confidence in her own judgment. She had been making plans, he explained, not just for charitable work, but for a fundamental change in how she lived her life. Diana had talked about writing a book, not the sensational tell-all that some had speculated about, but an honest account of her experiences that might help other women in similar situations. She had been in contact with publishers, quietly exploring her options. More significantly, she had been consulting with lawyers about her rights and options as the mother of the future king. These weren't idle conversations, Charles explained to his nephews, but concrete steps toward a future that Diana was actively planning. The most disturbing revelation had come near the end of their conversation. Charles had hesitated before sharing it, but the look in William's eyes told him that half-truths would no longer be sufficient. Diana had called him just 5 days before her death, not from London or Paris, but from a location she wouldn't specify. She had been frightened, more frightened than he had ever heard her, and she had asked him a question that had haunted him ever since. "Charles," she had whispered into the phone, her voice barely audible, "if something happens to me, promise me you'll take care of the boys. Not just financially or practically, but promise me you'll make sure they know the truth about who their mother really was." He had tried to dismiss her fears, to reassure her that she was safe, that her imagination was running away with her. But Diana had cut him off with an intensity that had stopped him cold. "I'm not being dramatic," she had said. "I've learned things, Charles. Things about why my marriage really ended, about decisions that were made without my knowledge, about plans for my future that don't include my consent. I've been naive, but I'm not naive anymore. Promise me." He had promised, of course, but when pressed for details about what she had learned, Diana had grown evasive. She couldn't talk about it over the phone, she said. She would explain everything when she returned to London. She promised. She never got the chance. The silence in William's sitting room after Charles finished speaking had been profound. Harry had been the first to break it, his voice tight with controlled emotion. "The package," he had said simply. "We need to know what's in the package." And so they had driven to Althorpe together, 3 men bound by love for a woman who had been taken from them too soon, and by the growing certainty that they had never known the full truth of why she had been taken. The drive had been quiet, each man lost in his own thoughts about what they might discover and what obligations a discovery might create. Back at Althorpe, in the study where Charles now sat alone, they had gathered around the desk as he carefully opened the package Diana had sent him 27 years earlier. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper that had yellowed with age, they found a collection of items that would change everything they thought they knew about Diana's final months. There were photographs, dozens of them, showing Diana in locations, and with people that had never been reported by the press. Some were clearly surveillance photos, taken from a distance without her knowledge. Others appeared to be documentation she had created herself, carefully recording meetings and encounters that she obviously felt were significant. There was a notebook filled with Diana's handwriting, dates and times, and names that read like intelligence reports rather than personal reflections. The entries detailed meetings with individuals whose names Charles didn't recognize, conversations about arrangements and agreements that seemed to exist in a shadow world parallel to Diana's public life. Most disturbing were the letters, copies of correspondence between Diana and various officials, lawyers, and advisors. The letters revealed a level of legal and political maneuvering around Diana's life that none of them had suspected. There were discussions about custody arrangements that went far beyond what had been publicly disclosed, negotiations about Diana's future role that treated her more like a diplomatic asset than a person, and references to contingency plans that seemed to anticipate scenarios none of them wanted to contemplate. But it was the final item in the package that had left all 3 men speechless. It was a letter addressed to Charles, dated just 1 day before Diana's fatal trip to Paris. In it, she had written with clarity and conviction about her growing awareness that her life was not entirely her own, that decisions about her future were being made by people she was no longer certain she could trust. She wrote about feeling caught between competing interests, all of whom claimed to have her best interests at heart, but whose true motivations she had begun to question. She mentioned specific individuals by name, including some who had been considered among her closest advisors. She expressed particular concern about recent changes in her security arrangements, changes that had been presented as upgrades, but that she had come to view with suspicion. Most chilling was her final paragraph, written in handwriting that seemed more urgent than the careful script that preceded it. She had discovered something, she wrote, something that connected her divorce settlement, her charitable work, and her relationships in ways that suggested a level of manipulation she was only beginning to understand. She couldn't provide details in the letter, she explained, because she wasn't certain who could be trusted with the information. But she had documented everything, she assured Charles, and if anything happened to her, the evidence would be in a location known only to one other person. The letter ended with an apology, not for anything she had done, but for the burden she was placing on her brother. She knew that opening this package would change his life, she wrote, but she also knew that he was the only person she trusted to make the right decision about what to do with the truth. Sitting in his study now, 3 days after opening Diana's package, Charles felt the weight of that trust pressing down on him like a physical force. The evidence Diana had gathered painted a picture of systematic manipulation and control that extended far beyond what anyone had suspected. If even half of what she had documented was true, then her death had not been just a tragic accident, but the endpoint of a campaign of psychological pressure that had left her isolated, frightened, and increasingly desperate to break free. The implications were staggering, not just for how the public understood Diana's story, but for the monarchy itself. The documents suggested a level of interference in Diana's life that went far beyond the official narrative of a messy divorce and difficult adjustment to post-royal life. They pointed to coordinated efforts to control her movements, her relationships, and even her charitable work in ways that served institutional interests rather than her own well-being. Charles picked up his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found the number Rebecca Morrison had provided. The journalist had been patient, professional, and refreshingly direct about her intentions. She wasn't interested in sensation or speculation, she had assured him, but in creating a complete and accurate record of Diana's final year. She had access to official documents through Freedom of Information requests, she explained, and testimony from former royal protection officers and household staff. What she needed was someone who could provide context, someone who could explain what those documents meant in human terms. Before making the call, Charles walked once more to Diana's childhood bedroom. The late afternoon light filtering through the windows cast long shadows across her old possessions, creating an atmosphere of melancholy that seemed appropriate to the moment. He stood in the doorway, remembering the girl who had once lived in this room, who had dreamed of love and happiness with the innocent certainty that only the young possess. That girl had become a woman who changed the world through her compassion and authenticity, but she had paid a price for that transformation that no one should have had to pay. If Charles was going to honor her memory properly, he realized he needed to honor all of it, not just the parts that were comfortable or convenient, but the difficult truths that revealed the cost of living authentically in a world that valued appearances over reality. He returned to his study and dialed Rebecca Morrison's number. When she answered, Charles spoke without preamble. "Ms. Morrison, this is Earl Spencer. I'm ready to talk, and I have documents I think you need to see, but we're going to do this properly with dignity and respect for my sister's memory. Are you prepared for a story that might be more complicated than anything you've imagined?" Rebecca's response was immediate and professional. "Lord Spencer, I've been preparing for this story for 3 years. The question isn't whether I'm ready for complexity, it's whether the world is ready for the truth about Princess Diana." As Charles hung up the phone, he felt a strange sense of relief mixed with apprehension. The machinery of revelation had been set in motion, and there would be no stopping it now. Diana's truth would finally be told in all its complexity and pain and beauty. The world would learn who she really was, not just the icon they had created, but the woman she had struggled to remain despite the forces that had sought to reshape her. Outside his window, the mist had lifted from the grounds of Althorpe, revealing the landscape in sharp, clear detail. Charles took this as a good omen. After 27 years of fog and confusion, perhaps it was time for clarity, whatever the cost might be. The London office of The Guardian felt like a fortress against the chaos brewing outside. Rebecca Morrison had chosen the location carefully, knowing that other news organizations would be watching for any sign of the story she was developing. The meeting with Charles Spencer had been arranged for early evening, when most of the building would be empty except for the night staff and the few reporters working on breaking stories. Charles arrived precisely on time, carrying a leather briefcase that seemed modest considering the explosive potential of its contents. With him came Sarah Ferguson, whose presence had surprised Rebecca despite the Earl's advance warning. The Duchess of York looked nervous but determined, her usual public composure replaced by something more raw and genuine. Rebecca had spent the previous week preparing for this moment, reviewing every piece of publicly available information about Diana's final year and cross-referencing it with the documents she had already obtained through official channels. What she had found was a pattern of inconsistencies and gaps that suggested a coordinated effort to shape the narrative of Diana's post-divorce life. The three of them settled into Rebecca's office, a cramped space made even smaller by the towers of documents and research materials that covered every available surface. Charles looked around at the controlled chaos and smiled slightly, reminding Rebecca that Diana would have loved the organized mayhem of a working newsroom. "Before we begin," Charles said, placing his briefcase on the desk, "I need you to understand something. My sister was not a saint, and I'm not trying to paint her as one. She made mistakes, had flaws, could be difficult and impulsive, but she was also one of the most genuinely caring people I've ever known, and she deserved better than what happened to her. This story isn't about revenge or settling scores. It's about making sure history remembers her honestly." Rebecca nodded, recognizing the importance of establishing ground rules. She had interviewed enough grieving families to understand the delicate balance between truth-telling and respect for the deceased. "Lord Spencer, I appreciate your directness. My goal is to create as complete a picture as possible of your sister's final year. I'm not interested in destroying anyone unnecessarily, but I also can't ignore evidence of wrongdoing if it exists." Sarah leaned forward in her chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "What you need to understand, Ms. Morrison, is that Diana was changing in those final months. She was becoming more confident, more willing to challenge the system that had controlled her for so long. Some people found that threatening." Charles opened his briefcase and removed Diana's notebook, the one they had found in her package. He handed it to Rebecca, watching her face carefully as she began to read Diana's careful documentation of meetings, phone calls, and incidents that had alarmed her. "She started keeping these records in March of 1997, Charles explained, "about 4 months after her divorce was finalized. At first, I think it was just a way for her to process what had happened to her marriage and to organize her thoughts about her future. But, as you'll see, it became something more systematic." Rebecca scanned the entries, her journalist's instincts immediately recognizing patterns that suggested professional-level intelligence gathering rather than personal reflection. Diana had recorded not just what had happened during various encounters, but details about the people involved, their connections to each other and to official institutions, their apparent motivations, inconsistencies in their stories. One entry in particular caught Rebecca's attention. Dated July 15, 1997, it described a meeting Diana had been asked to attend at a private club in Mayfair. The meeting had been presented as a briefing about security concerns related to her upcoming charitable work, but Diana's notes suggested something quite different had occurred. According to her account, she had been told that her activities were being closely monitored not just for her protection, but to ensure they didn't create complications for ongoing government policies. Her work with landmine victims, in particular, had apparently caused concern among defense officials who felt her advocacy was undermining British military interests. The suggestion had been made, gently but clearly, that she might want to consider focusing her efforts on less politically sensitive causes. Diana's response, as recorded in her notebook, had been characteristically direct. She had asked whether this was a request or a demand, and when the answer had been evasive, she had stood up and walked out of the meeting. But she had also noted the names of everyone present and their apparent affiliations, suggesting she had understood the significance of what had occurred. She was being managed, Sarah said quietly, reading over Rebecca's shoulder. Not just by the royal household, but by people with much broader authority. Diana started to realize that her divorce hadn't freed her from control. It had just changed who was trying to control her. Charles removed another set of documents from his briefcase. Copies of correspondence between Diana and various officials that showed a pattern of increasingly intrusive oversight of her activities. There were requests for advance notice of her travel plans, suggestions about appropriate companions for public appearances, and even recommendations about which charitable causes deserved her attention. What made the correspondence particularly unsettling was its tone. The letters were polite, even deferential on the surface, but beneath the diplomatic language lay unmistakable threats. Diana's failure to cooperate with these suggestions could result in complications for her son's futures, changes to her security arrangements, or difficulties with her charitable work. The message was clear: comply, or face consequences that would extend far beyond her own life. She felt trapped. Charles continued, his voice heavy with emotion. Not by the paparazzi or public attention, but by people who were supposed to be protecting her interests. She started to understand that the divorce settlement hadn't been negotiated in her favor as much as she had believed. There were conditions and obligations that weren't in the public documents, agreements that gave others significant control over her activities. Rebecca's mind was racing as she processed the implications of what she was hearing. The official narrative of Diana's post-divorce life had emphasized her newfound freedom and independence, her ability to pursue causes close to her heart without royal protocol constraints. But the evidence Charles was sharing suggested that freedom had been largely illusory, that Diana had simply exchanged one form of control for another, possibly more restrictive one. "Tell me about the final weeks," Rebecca said, turning to a fresh page in her notebook. What was Diana's state of mind? How was she behaving? Sarah and Charles exchanged glances before Sarah answered. She was different in those last weeks. More determined, but also more careful. She had started varying her routines, changing plans at the last minute, even avoiding places she had previously felt safe. It wasn't paranoia. It was the behavior of someone who had good reason to be cautious. Charles retrieved one final document from his briefcase, a letter Diana had written to him, but never sent. It had been found among her personal papers at Kensington Palace and forwarded to him months after her death by a staff member who felt he should see it. The letter was dated August 25th, 1997, just 6 days before her death. In it, Diana wrote about a recent conversation with someone she identified only as him, who had told her about arrangements being made for her future that she had not been consulted about. The letter suggested that Diana had been presented with an ultimatum: cooperate with these arrangements or face consequences that would affect her son's inheritance and future positions. Diana's response to this ultimatum, according to the letter, had been to begin documenting everything she could about the network of control surrounding her. She had realized, she wrote, that her value to various interests had nothing to do with her happiness or well-being, and everything to do with her utility as a symbol and influence. The divorce, she had come to understand, hadn't freed her from this system, but had simply made her position within it more precarious. She was planning to go public, Charles said quietly. Not immediately, and not recklessly, but she was building a case. She wanted to expose the manipulation not for revenge, but to protect other people who might find themselves in similar situations. She talked about it as a form of public service. Rebecca looked up from her notes, her expression grave. "Lord Spencer, what you're describing sounds like a systematic campaign of intimidation against a vulnerable individual. If this documentation is accurate, we're not just talking about privacy violations or media manipulation. We're talking about something that approaches psychological warfare." The room fell silent as the full implications of that statement settled over them. Charles reached into his briefcase one final time and removed a small cassette tape, the kind that had been common in the 1990s for recording personal notes or interviews. "There's one more thing," he said, holding the tape as if it might explode. Diana made this recording 3 days before she left for Paris. It was in the package with everything else. I haven't listened to it yet. I wanted witnesses when I played it for the first time. Rebecca's office had an old cassette player, a relic from an earlier era of journalism, when recordings were still made on analog media. Charles inserted the tape with hands that shook slightly, then looked at his companions before pressing play. Diana's voice filled the room, clear and determined, but with an underlying tension that spoke to the fear she had been living with. The recording was obviously made in private, probably in her bedroom at Kensington Palace late at night, when she could be certain of not being overheard. "Charles," her recorded voice began, "if you're listening to this, then something has happened to me, and you've finally opened the package I sent you. I hope it was your decision to open it, and not something forced upon you by circumstances." She paused in the recording, and they could hear her breathing, steadying herself for what came next. "I need you to know that everything in this package is true and documented. I haven't exaggerated or misinterpreted anything. The people whose names are in my notebook, the meetings I've described, the threats that have been made, all of it happened exactly as I've recorded it." Another pause, longer this time. "I also need you to know that I'm not afraid anymore. I was afraid for a long time, afraid of what they might do to William and Harry if I didn't cooperate, afraid of what they might take away from me if I challenged them too directly. But I've realized that my fear was actually making things worse, not just for me, but potentially for my son's futures." Diana's voice grew stronger as the recording continued. "I've made copies of everything, and I've taken steps to ensure that the truth will survive even if I don't. I'm not planning on dying, Charles, but I'm also not naive about the forces I'm dealing with. These are people who view human beings as chess pieces, and they've made it clear that my continued cooperation is not optional." The recording went on for nearly 20 minutes, with Diana providing specific details about individuals and incidents that corroborated and expanded on what was already in her written documentation. She spoke about pressure campaigns disguised as helpful advice, about financial incentives offered to people in her circle in exchange for information about her activities, about a growing network of surveillance that went far beyond legitimate security concerns. But perhaps most significant was what Diana revealed about her plans. She had been in contact with investigative journalists. She explained, people who specialized in exposing institutional corruption and abuse of power. She had been carefully building a case that would not only reveal what had been done to her, but would also protect others who might be vulnerable to similar treatment in the future. "I know this will cause problems," Diana's voice continued, "and I know it will be painful for William and Harry to learn about. But I also know that silence and compliance haven't protected anyone. They've just enabled the system to continue operating without accountability." When the tape ended, the 3 people in Rebecca's office sat in stunned silence. The implications of what they had just heard went far beyond personal tragedy to touch on fundamental questions about power, accountability, and the treatment of individuals who challenged institutional authority. Rebecca was the first to speak, her voice carefully controlled. "Lord Spencer, this evidence suggests criminal activity, conspiracy, intimidation, possibly worse. This isn't just a story anymore. It's a case that should be investigated by law enforcement." Charles nodded slowly. "I know." Diana knew too. But she also knew that official investigations could be controlled or suppressed. That's why she wanted the story told by journalists first, to create public pressure for accountability. Sarah had been quiet throughout the recording, but now she looked up with tears in her eyes. She was so brave in those final weeks, braver than any of us realized. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for the principle that people shouldn't be controlled and manipulated by institutions that claim to serve their interests. As the evening wore on, the 3 of them began to plan how Diana's story would be told. It would need to be careful, methodical, and absolutely accurate. The evidence would need to be corroborated wherever possible, and the legal implications would need to be considered at every step. But Most importantly, the story would need to honor Diana's memory by focusing not just on how she had been victimized, but on how she had fought back with intelligence, courage, and an unwavering commitment to truth. Rebecca made it clear that publication would not happen quickly. The documents would need to be authenticated, sources would need to be verified, and legal review would be extensive. But the process had begun, and there would be no turning back now. Charles felt a mixture of relief and terror as he realized what they had set in motion. Diana's truth would finally be told. But the revelation would inevitably cause pain for people he loved and upheaval for institutions he had been raised to respect. The cost of silence had become too high, but the cost of speaking might prove to be higher than any of them could imagine. The first article appeared on a Tuesday morning in March, carefully timed to avoid major news cycles that might bury its impact. Rebecca Morrison had spent 4 months authenticating Diana's documents and cross-referencing them with official records obtained through persistent Freedom of Information requests. The headline was deliberately understated. New evidence emerges about Princess Diana's final year. Within hours, the story had exploded across social media and international news networks. The Guardian's website crashed twice from the volume of traffic, and Rebecca's phone hadn't stopped ringing since dawn. But it wasn't just the public reaction that surprised everyone involved. It was the speed and coordination of the official response. By noon, Buckingham Palace had released a statement expressing deep concern about unfounded allegations and promising a thorough review of the claims. The statement was notably specific in its denials, addressing points that had only been hinted at in the published article, suggesting that palace officials had been prepared for this revelation or had access to information about what was coming. Charles Spencer sat in his London apartment, watching the news coverage with a mixture of satisfaction and dread. The story was being taken seriously by major outlets, but he could also see the machinery of damage control spinning into action. Former royal officials were being interviewed, character witnesses were being produced, and carefully worded statements were being released that didn't quite deny the allegations, but suggested they were exaggerated or misinterpreted. His phone rang constantly throughout the day. Some calls were from reporters seeking additional comment, others from friends and family members expressing concern or outrage. The most difficult call came from his nephew William, whose voice was tight with controlled emotion. "Uncle Charles," William said without preamble, "I need to know how much more is coming. The palace is asking me to make a statement to distance the current royal family from whatever happened in 1997. They're treating this like a historical curiosity rather than something that affected real people's lives." Charles understood William's position. As the future king, he had to balance his role as Diana's son with his obligations to the institution he would someday lead. But Charles also knew that silence and diplomatic deflection would only fuel more speculation and potentially more damaging revelations. "There's more, William," Charles admitted. "Rebecca has been careful to verify everything before publication, but Diana documented extensive manipulation and surveillance. The full scope of what happened to her is going to shock people." The conversation that followed was one of the most difficult Charles had ever had with his nephew. William needed to prepare for revelations that would likely implicate senior royal advisors and government officials in a campaign of psychological pressure against his mother. The evidence suggested that Diana's post-divorce life had been carefully managed and controlled in ways that went far beyond legitimate security concerns. Meanwhile, at The Guardian, Rebecca was preparing the second installment of the series. This one focused on the specific individuals and institutions that had been involved in what Diana had termed her management. The names in Diana's notebook read like a who's who of British establishment figures: senior civil servants, royal household officials, intelligence service liaisons, and private security consultants who had worked closely with government agencies. What made the story particularly compelling was the level of detail Diana had recorded. She hadn't just documented what had happened to her, but had researched the backgrounds and connections of the people involved, creating a network map that showed how various interests had coordinated their efforts to control her activities. One revelation that particularly disturbed Rebecca was Diana's discovery that several of her closest advisors had been reporting her activities to other parties without her knowledge. People she had trusted with intimate details of her life, her plans, and her concerns had been systematically betraying that trust, often in exchange for financial compensation or career advancement. Diana had learned about these betrayals through a source she identified in her notes only as the friend, someone who had access to high-level information, but whose identity remained a mystery. The friend had provided Diana with copies of reports about her activities, reports that were far more detailed and invasive than anything legitimate security work would have required. The reports covered everything from Diana's romantic relationships to her conversations with her therapists, from her charitable activities to her private meetings with journalists and authors. The level of surveillance described in the documents went far beyond anything the public had ever suspected, suggesting a systematic violation of Diana's privacy that continued long after her divorce. As Rebecca worked on the second article, she began to receive pressure from unexpected sources. Legal representatives for several of the individuals named in Diana's notebook reached out, not to deny their involvement, but to question the authenticity of the documents and to threaten legal action if unsubstantiated allegations were published. More concerning were the unofficial contacts, phone calls from people who claimed to have Diana's best interests at heart, visits from individuals who wanted to provide context for the allegations, offers of alternative information that might cast doubt on Diana's documentation. Rebecca recognized these tactics from her previous investigations into institutional wrongdoing. The response was too coordinated, too sophisticated to be spontaneous. The pressure wasn't limited to legal and professional channels. Rebecca's personal life began to feel the effects as well. Her apartment building's security system malfunctioned repeatedly, requiring visits from repair technicians she hadn't requested. Her phone service experienced mysterious interruptions. Her email was hacked, though nothing seemed to be stolen. The message was clear without being explicit. Some people preferred that Diana's story remain untold. But the pressure also came from more sympathetic sources. Other journalists contacted Rebecca, sharing their own experiences investigating Diana's death and the official response they had encountered. Several mentioned similar patterns of interference and intimidation, suggesting that attempts to control Diana's narrative had continued long after her death. One particular contact proved especially valuable. Martin Bashir, the journalist who had conducted Diana's explosive 1995 Panorama interview, reached out to Rebecca with information he had never previously disclosed. During his preparation for that interview, he explained he had been contacted by individuals claiming to represent Diana's interests who had tried to influence the questions he would ask and the topics he would explore. Bashir had resisted these attempts at the time, but he had documented them, suspecting they might be relevant to future reporting about Diana. The documents he shared with Rebecca showed that even Diana's most famous moment of speaking truth about her marriage had been subject to behind-the-scenes manipulation by people whose motivations remained unclear. As the second article neared publication, Charles Spencer found himself under increasing pressure from within his own family and social circle. Distant relatives expressed concern about the damage the revelations might cause to the Spencer family's reputation. Former friends from aristocratic circles suggested that some secrets were better left buried, that Diana's memory was better served by focusing on her charitable legacy rather than the more painful aspects of her final year. The most painful criticism came from those who had genuinely cared about Diana, but who believed that exposing the truth would only cause additional pain for her sons and for others who had loved her. They argued that the dead deserved peace, that raking over old grievances served no constructive purpose. Charles wrestled with these arguments, particularly during sleepless nights when doubt crept in about the wisdom of his decision. But each time he wavered, he remembered Diana's voice on that final recording, her determination to ensure that the truth survived even if she didn't. She had trusted him with her story, and betraying that trust through continued silence would be a greater disservice to her memory than any temporary discomfort the truth might cause. The second article was published on a Friday, strategically chosen to dominate the weekend news cycle. This installment focused on specific incidents of surveillance and intimidation, naming names and providing documentation that made denial difficult. The response was immediate and intense. Several of the individuals named in Diana's documentation released statements through their lawyers, categorically denying the allegations and questioning the reliability of documents that had allegedly been in private possession for decades. But their denials were notably specific, addressing details that hadn't been made public, again suggesting advanced knowledge of what Diana had recorded. More significantly, the article prompted other witnesses to come forward. Former Royal Protection officers contacted The Guardian with their own accounts of unusual instructions they had received regarding Diana's security. Staff members from hotels and restaurants where Diana had regularly visited shared stories about being questioned by people claiming official authority about her habits and preferences. The picture that emerged from these additional testimonies was of a surveillance operation that went far beyond normal security procedures. Diana had been monitored with the intensity typically reserved for foreign intelligence targets or suspected criminals, and the information gathered about her had been shared among multiple agencies and institutions. But it was the testimony of the friend that provided the most shocking revelations. In the fourth month of the investigation, this mysterious source agreed to speak with Rebecca on the condition of complete anonymity. What they revealed added a dimension to Diana's story that no one had suspected. The friend, who had worked in a senior position within the intelligence community, explained that Diana had been the subject of what was euphemistically termed a protective monitoring operation, beginning shortly after her separation from Prince Charles. The operation had been justified as necessary to protect both Diana and the monarchy from potential security threats, but its scope had expanded far beyond its original mandate. According to the friend, the operation had evolved into something approaching a control mechanism, with various agencies and interests using their access to information about Diana's life to influence her decisions and behavior. The goal wasn't just to monitor her activities, but to shape them in ways that served institutional interests rather than her personal well-being. The friend provided Rebecca with copies of official documents that corroborated many of Diana's allegations, including memos discussing strategies for managing her public statements, plans for guiding her charitable work toward less controversial causes, and assessments of her psychological state that had been prepared without her knowledge or consent. Most damaging were documents that suggested the surveillance operation had continued even after officials became aware that it was causing Diana significant psychological distress. Reports from as late as July 1997 noted her increasing paranoia and isolation, but recommended continued monitoring rather than a reduction in surveillance activities. The operation had taken on a life of its own. The friend explained to Rebecca during their clandestine meeting in a quiet cafe in North London. What had started as legitimate security work had become a form of institutional persecution. Diana wasn't wrong to feel controlled and manipulated. She was being controlled and manipulated by people who justified their actions as necessary for national security. As the fourth article in the series was prepared for publication, Charles Spencer realized that they had crossed a threshold from which there would be no return. The evidence was too comprehensive, too well documented to be dismissed as speculation or misinterpretation. Diana's allegations weren't the paranoid fantasies of a troubled woman. They were the careful documentation of systematic abuse by people in positions of trust and authority. The official response had also revealed the continuing power of the forces Diana had struggled against. The speed with which denials had been prepared, the coordination of the response across multiple institutions, the subtle pressure applied to witnesses and sources, all of it suggested that the network of control Diana had identified was still operational and still willing to protect itself. Charles found himself thinking about his sister's courage in her final weeks, her determination to create a record of what had been done to her despite knowing the risks involved. She had understood that her documentation might be her only protection, the only way to ensure that the truth would survive if something happened to her. The thought was both inspiring and terrifying. Diana had faced down forces that most people couldn't even imagine, had documented their actions with the precision of a trained investigator, and had trusted her family to complete the work she had started. The burden of that trust was enormous, but Charles was beginning to understand that carrying it might be the most important thing he ever did for his sister's memory. As he prepared for the media storm that the fourth article would inevitably create, Charles felt something he hadn't experienced since Diana's death, a sense of connection to his sister that transcended grief and guilt. He was finally doing what she had asked him to do, finally keeping the promise he had made in Westminster Abbey all those years ago. Diana's truth was being told, and with each revelation, her killer's carefully constructed lies were crumbling into dust. 6 months after the first article appeared, the world had fundamentally changed its understanding of Princess Diana's death. What had begun as Charles Spencer's private decision to honor his sister's memory had evolved into the largest investigation into institutional misconduct in modern British history. The final article in Rebecca Morrison's series had been published to global shockwaves, but the story was far from over. The evidence Diana had so carefully documented had prompted multiple official investigations. The Metropolitan Police had reopened their inquiry into her death, this time with access to documents that had previously been classified or overlooked. Parliamentary committees had been formed to investigate the extent of unauthorized surveillance of British citizens. International human rights organizations had launched their own reviews of what they termed state-sponsored psychological warfare against a private citizen. Charles Spencer stood in Westminster Abbey on a cold December morning, exactly 28 years after Diana's funeral. But this time, he wasn't delivering a eulogy for the dead. He was speaking at a service of remembrance for the living, for the woman Diana had truly been rather than the sanitized version history had tried to preserve. The congregation was smaller than it had been for her funeral, but in many ways more significant. William and Harry sat in the front row with their families, their faces reflecting a complex mixture of grief and resolution. They had chosen to attend despite intense pressure from royal advisors to distance themselves from the continuing revelations about their mother's final year. Behind them sat the people who had truly known Diana, her former staff members who had finally felt safe to speak honestly about what they had witnessed, journalists who had been intimidated into silence, but who had now found their voices, friends who had been marginalized or discredited for suggesting that Diana's death deserved more scrutiny. Also present were some unexpected faces. Several former government officials had come forward after the publication of Rebecca's series, admitting their roles in what had been euphemistically termed Diana's protective management and expressing regret for decisions they had made under pressure from their superiors. Their testimonies had provided crucial corroboration for Diana's allegations and had helped investigators understand the full scope of the operation that had controlled her final year. The service itself was Diana's final victory over the forces that had tried to control her narrative. Instead of the carefully orchestrated ceremony that had marked her funeral, this gathering was authentic, personal, and honest about both her strengths and her struggles. Charles spoke about the sister he had known, not just the princess the world had admired, but the complex, courageous woman who had refused to be silenced even when silence might have saved her life. Diana always believed that truth was more powerful than fear, Charles told the assembled congregation. She proved that belief with her life, and even more powerfully with her death. The evidence she left behind has not only vindicated her concerns, but has created accountability where none existed before. She has saved others from the fate she suffered, which I believe was always her greatest hope. The investigation into Diana's death had indeed uncovered evidence of systematic misconduct that extended far beyond her case. The The surveillance network that had monitored her activities had also been used against other individuals who were deemed potentially problematic by various governmental and institutional interests. Journalists, activists, political dissidents, and even some members of parliament have been subjected to similar invasive monitoring and psychological pressure campaigns. The revelations had led to the largest reform of intelligence oversight in British history. New laws have been passed requiring judicial approval for surveillance operations against British citizens, regardless of their public profile. Whistleblower protections have been strengthened after it was revealed that several officials had tried to warn their superiors about the ethical problems with Diana's management, but had been silenced or transferred. Most significantly, a special prosecutor had been appointed to investigate whether criminal charges should be filed against individuals who had exceeded their authority in their treatment of Diana. The investigation was ongoing, but early indications suggested that multiple officials from different agencies would face charges ranging from conspiracy to stalking to criminal harassment. For Charles, the vindication of Diana's allegations had been bittersweet. While it had proven that his sister hadn't been paranoid or delusional in her final months, it had also confirmed that she had died while living in legitimate fear for her safety and freedom. The documents she had left behind painted a picture of a woman under siege, fighting for her autonomy against overwhelming institutional pressure. But, perhaps more importantly, the investigation had revealed Diana's extraordinary courage in documenting what was happening to her. The friend, who had eventually been identified as a mid-level intelligence analyst with a conscience, had testified that Diana's record-keeping had been more thorough and accurate than many official intelligence reports. She had taught herself surveillance detection techniques, had learned to recognize and document harassment tactics, and had built a case against her tormentors with the skill of a professional investigator. Rebecca Morrison's final article in the series had focused on this aspect of Diana's story: her transformation from victim to investigator, her refusal to accept the role of helpless prey that had been assigned to her. The article had been titled "The Investigation Diana Conducted into Her Own Life," and it had revealed the princess as someone far more formidable than her public image had suggested. The article detailed how Diana had used her charitable work as cover for meeting with investigative journalists and legal experts, how she had carefully documented every attempt to control or manipulate her, and how she had built networks of support among people who were also being targeted by institutional abuse. She had been preparing to go public with her findings, the article revealed, and her trip to Paris had been intended as a brief respite before launching what she had privately termed the fight of my life. The implications of this revelation had been staggering. Diana hadn't died as a helpless victim of surveillance and harassment. She had died as an active opponent of those forces, someone who had been preparing to expose them publicly. Her death had prevented not just her personal liberation, but the exposure of a system that continued to operate against other vulnerable individuals. The response to this final article had been different from the reactions to the earlier pieces. Instead of denial and deflection, there had been a groundswell of support for additional investigation and reform. Diana's courage in fighting back had inspired others to come forward with their own experiences of institutional harassment and control. A victim support group had been formed, led by individuals who had been subjected to similar surveillance and intimidation tactics. Their testimonies had revealed that Diana's case, while extreme in its scope and intensity, was part of a broader pattern of abuse directed against anyone whose activities or statements were deemed problematic by institutional authorities. The group had successfully lobbied for the creation of an independent oversight body with the authority to investigate complaints about government surveillance and harassment. They had also pushed for compensation programs for victims of unauthorized surveillance and for stronger legal protections against the kind of psychological warfare that had been directed against Diana. Charles had been deeply moved by the courage of these other victims, many of whom had suffered in silence for years because they believed no one would take their allegations seriously. Diana's documentation had provided them with validation and a framework for understanding what had been done to them. Her decision to create a record of her experiences had indeed protected others, just as she had hoped. The personal impact on Diana's family had been complex and ongoing. William had eventually made a statement supporting the investigation and calling for accountability, but the strain of the revelations had been evident in his public appearances. The knowledge that his mother had died while fighting for her freedom rather than simply being victimized had been both empowering and devastating. Harry had responded more emotionally, giving interviews where he spoke candidly about his anger at the system that had tormented his mother and his pride in her courage in fighting back. His willingness to speak openly about the impact of the revelations had helped humanize the story and had encouraged other family members of surveillance victims to share their own experiences. For Charles, the most profound change had been in his relationship with Diana's memory. The guilt that had haunted him for 28 years had been replaced by a different emotion: pride in his sister's strength and determination, and satisfaction in finally fulfilling the promise he had made to protect her truth. The open package had contained more than just documentation of Diana's surveillance and harassment. It had also included personal letters to her sons, written during her final weeks, that revealed her hopes and fears for their futures. These letters, which Charles had shared privately with William and Harry before excerpts appeared in the final article, had shown Diana at her most vulnerable and most loving. In her letter to William, Diana had written about her awareness that he would someday face many of the same pressures she had experienced, and her hope that her documentation of institutional misconduct might help protect him from similar manipulation. She had urged him to remember that being future king didn't mean accepting abuse or allowing others to make decisions about his life without his consent. To Harry, she had written about the importance of speaking truth even when it was inconvenient or uncomfortable for others. She had encouraged him to trust his instincts about people and situations, and to never let anyone convince him that his emotional responses to injustice were inappropriate or excessive. Both letters had included specific warnings about individuals who had gained Diana's trust only to betray it, and advice about how to recognize and resist manipulation tactics that might be used against them in the future. The letters had been like a masterclass in institutional survival, written by someone who had learned those lessons through bitter experience. The final revelation had come not for Diana's package, but from an unexpected source. A former senior civil servant, terminally ill and approaching the end of his life, had contacted Charles directly with information that provided crucial context for everything Diana had documented. The surveillance and control operation, he explained, had been initiated not primarily out of concern for Diana's safety, but out of fear about her growing influence and independence. After her divorce, Diana had been free to pursue relationships and causes that might conflict with government policies or royal interests. Rather than accept this reality, certain officials had decided to maintain control through covert means. The operation had been justified internally as a form of protective custody, a way to keep Diana safe, while ensuring her activities didn't create diplomatic or political complications. But as Diana had become more resistant to this covert control, the operation had become increasingly aggressive and invasive. The dying civil servant's testimony had provided the missing piece of the puzzle, the institutional mindset that had made Diana's treatment possible. She hadn't been targeted because she was dangerous, but because she was free, and her freedom had been seen as a threat to systems that depended on control and predictability. Standing in Westminster Abbey on that December morning, Charles reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. Diana's truth had been told, not perfectly or completely, but honestly and with respect for her memory. The investigation had brought accountability where none had existed, had provided justice for a woman who had died, believing she was fighting alone against overwhelming odds. The service concluded with a reading from one of Diana's favorite poems, chosen not by protocol officers or royal tradition, but by her sons who had finally learned to understand their mother not as a tragic figure or a perfect saint, but as a complex, brave woman who had refused to surrender her authenticity to the demands of institutional power. As the congregation dispersed, Charles lingered in the abbey, looking up at the altar where he had once stood to bury his sister. The weight he had carried for 28 years had finally been lifted, replaced by something lighter, but no less significant. The knowledge that Diana's courage had not died with her, but had lived on in the truth she had trusted him to protect. Outside, London carried on with its daily business, largely unaware that within the ancient walls of Westminster Abbey, a promise made in grief had finally been kept in love. Diana Spencer had achieved in death what had been denied to her in life: the right to have her story told honestly, completely, and with the dignity she had always deserved. The investigation she had begun in her final months had been completed by those who loved her, and her truth had indeed set her free.